How many band names does one guy need for a band anyway? Welcome back to the channel, Growing Up Punk. Of course, if you're new here, we're just kind of getting this thing going. We come from a podcast. I keep saying we, it's only me that's on these videos. But of course, Growing Up Punk is a podcast about punk rock and all of its friends. Today's YouTube vinyl collecting episode, you probably noticed by, the title, is not really a punk album, not really a punk band, but influenced a number of punk, especially pop punk bands. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that. Of course, I'm talking about Elvis Costello, whether, it's Elvis Costello or it's Elvis Costello and the Attractions. I think there's Elvis Costello and the Imposters. I feel like he's got a number of different band names, most of which I couldn't tell you, who's releasing which album. We're talking specifically about one album today, and that would be this year's Model. But as you can see on the wall behind me, whether it's in focus or not, I'm not entirely sure. I got a couple different Elvis Costello records that I've collected over the years. And I thought we'd kind of quickly go through some of these, how I got them, and then we'll get into talking about this year's Model. So the first one I want to mention is actually this one down here. And it's down here for a reason. This is Armed Forces by Elvis Costello. I say it's down there for a reason because I bought it from, I believe, a garage sale for like $2. And it looks like I paid $2 for it because you can't see it the way the shot's framed, but there's a sticker on there, and there's even a sticker on the label of the record of, who it belonged to. It's a rainbow sticker, so that's kind of cool, I guess. Maybe they got it when they were a child. I'm not entirely sure. Or it was just the only sticker they had kicking around. It's a nice little green pasture with a rainbow sort of thing. Anyway, that record, I actually really like it. And looking at the front of it, didn't really know what it was. But when I flipped it over, I was like, oh, I've seen this before. And of course, on the back side of Armed Forces is the picture with like the stampeding elephant sort of thing. There is a great song on this record, which is what's so funny about Peace, Love, and Understanding. And of course, that was actually a single a couple of years before. It was the B-side of a single even. If I understand correctly, the single wasn't even an Elvis Costello single. The song's written by Nick Lowe, but Elvis Costello is the one who performed it on the B-side of a Nick Lowe single called American Squirm. Anyway, they decided because it was so successful to tack it onto the last track of that album, and it's there. Another one that I've got back here, this one right in the middle, would be Trust, and I bought that from a local record shop that's here in Edmonton that's no longer open, called Permanent Records. I used to love going into that shop because I would spend a good amount of time chatting with a guy by the name of Clint, who I'm not sure if he owned it, if he's co-owner, just kind of like the regular guy there, whatever the case was. He's actually the guy who first told me to check out the book Our Band Could Be Your Life, which if you've been listening to the podcast or following on the blog, I've been reading lately. It just took me years to finally get around to reading it, I should say. But yeah, so I bought it just after one day hanging out, chatting with him. I was like, well, I got to go home with something. And so I just went over and looked. There were a couple different artists I was looking for, and Elvis Costello was one. So I picked up that record right there. And it's actually, I love it. The opening track, Clubland, is such a great song. It's got this really kind of subtle guitar lead in it that I absolutely love. If you've never heard it before, you should go check it out for sure. Another one here is that one over there, Punch the Clock. I actually bought that one from a record shop in Calgary, in Kensington in Calgary. I have no idea, can't remember the name of the shop. No idea if it's even still open or not, but I did buy that a number of years ago. In fact, it was the early 2000s. It was one of the very first records that I did end up going out and buying, specifically looking for an artist. It wasn't specifically looking for that record, but I went in, and the guy behind the desk, I said, hey, I'm just looking for some Elvis Costello. They had two on hand, one of which was that one. He recommended going home with that one, so I went home with it. The song Shipbuilding off that record, if you're not a fan of ballads, you're not really going to like it, but it's a really mellow piano ballad sort of thing. It's really good. Kind of comes out of nowhere and surprises you with how good it is. Another funny story, a side note on that one, which also ties into Our Band Could Be Your Life, would be that as I walked into that store, I had very much a high fidelity moment. If you've ever seen the movie, there's a scene where John Cusack's character Rob is working in his record shop, and he puts he says, I'm going to put this record on, the CD on, I'm going to sell, I forget how many copies of this album he's going to sell. He said, I'm going to sell X amount of copies of this album. So he puts it on, and people are all of a sudden vibing to it in the store, asking about who it is, sort of thing. So I had a very similar situation when I walked into this store. A guy puts a CD on, a guy who's the same guy working behind the till, and all of a sudden I'm like, what is this? This is awesome. And so I asked him. It turns out the album was Village Gorilla Head by Tommy Stinson, and I ended up buying it off of what I heard, the few seconds that I heard, because I really enjoyed it. Tommy Stinson, here's the connection to Our Band Could Be Your Life, actually used to be the bass player in The Replacements. So there you go, that's kind of neat. And then finally, I guess, would be this guy up here, My Aim Is True, which is Elvis Costello's first, at least his first full length. It could be, you know, not his first actual album, but his first full length really shows just that raw talent that he has, whatever you want to say. But it's a record that I, you know, kind of hunted down. I was able to buy it from a local guy who was selling a bunch of records. He just buys collections and goes through them and sells them. And so I was happy to finally be able to find it at a decent price. But that's going to bring us to the record that we're here to talk about. The record that I want to bring up and talk about today, which would be this guy right here. Of course, that's Elvis Costello's This Year's Model. Now, the reason I wanted to bring this up, why it came up recently for me, is that we just started our series on MXPX. Actually, by the time this video comes out, it's probably been, well, I guess a week or two, but my last video was about MXPX. And the reason I wanted to bring this one up was because Elvis Costello, I heard about Elvis Costello because of MXPX. I believe it was their DVD, It Came from Bremerton. Actually, probably a VHS, now that I think about it. I believe it was on that they talked about it, because I think B-Movie was too late. Because it was talking about the writing and production and all that kind of stuff for The Ever-Passing Moment. And on it, I believe it was Tom or Mike, really accurate here, mentions loving and listening a lot to This Year's Model by Elvis Costello. And I went, okay, I need to check that out. So eventually I searched it up. Another album that was recommended, I believe, on It Came from Bremerton that I ended up falling in love with was actually Dear You by Jawbreaker. We're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about This Year's Model by Elvis Costello. Now, on top of that, around that time as well, MXPX ended up covering a song off of this album, which I should show you the back sleeve here. This being the song that MXPX covered would actually be the opening track, which is No Action. And I remember the first time I heard it, I was like, man, I like that. I didn't realize it was a cover. I don't think I realized it was a cover until I bought this record and put it on, to be honest. And I went, wait a minute, I know this song. But this album, if you've never listened to it, I gotta say, it's probably one of the top like power pop albums. Elvis Costello would kind of start veering away from the straightforward power pop with a little bit of punk. Sort of, I mean, I guess he was always a power pop artist, but he definitely had some punk snarl, early punk snarl on this record and on My Aim Is True. And you can hear the influence on pop punk bands all over this record. And there's just some standout songs on here. Like I said, No Action, obviously, This Year's Girl. Pump It Up, that was probably the first song that I actually, when it was playing, outside of No Action, that I knew the actual version, because you hear it up here anyways at hockey games. And Little Triggers. Little Triggers is a song that I've already mentioned it once this episode, I'm a huge fan of High Fidelity, either the book or the movie. And I believe it's consistent in both the book and the movie. Again, the main character, Rob, is listing some of his, he constantly goes through making top 5 lists in this book and in this movie. And on one of them, I can't remember specifically if it's like his top 5 songs or whatever, but he mentions Little Triggers by Elvis Costello as being one of those songs. And when you hear the song, you can understand why Nick Hornby felt worth mentioning it in this story. But yeah, anyways, even the obviously Radio on the backside of this, the closing track on here. The interesting thing is that there's a deluxe version. I don't know if the deluxe version was ever released on vinyl, but the CD anyway features an added song. Now here's the thing, that's not uncommon for deluxe editions of albums. That's kind of one of the selling points, is these extra songs. But instead of just tacking 1 or 2 songs at the end, on the deluxe CD, there's in the middle, they've added a song. And I always thought that was a little strange. It's actually quite the song. It's called I Don't Want to Go to Chelsea. And it's kind of one of those songs where I'm like, why is that not on the original version of the record? And I haven't looked it up to find out, but you know, if you're listening to this and you look at the track listing on here, it's missing that song. I was always a little bit confused by that, but doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. This record is Absolutely. There was a couple of years ago, I did one of those social media, like top 10 albums. It was like just a picture, no explanation, no nothing. And so this year's model definitely made it onto that list for me. It's just kind of funny because, we talk on the show, on the podcast a lot about how, we would discover bands by reading CD liners, stuff like that. Elvis Costello, I never would have discovered by reading a CD liner, but it was still one of those bands that I was in love with that I discovered this album through, and I think that's pretty incredible. And it's kind of one of the reasons we do the podcast, do these videos, is just for ways to help you discover maybe music you haven't heard before. Maybe it's stuff you've heard of and just never listened to, or maybe it's stuff you got to go back to and listen to again. Who knows? But I did want to take a few minutes and talk about this year's model by Elvis Costello. I should pull the record out. I mean, we're collecting vinyl on this. As you can see, it's just a black record. Here's a little insider information, I guess you could say, on this one. The little intro in this video, I kind of go through and I pull out different records. The one that I'm putting on the turntable is actually this record right here. So I just thought, hey, why not? We'll slowly reveal that. I mean, that's the only one you couldn't actually see now that I think about it. You couldn't necessarily pinpoint. The rest were pretty obvious. But anyway, that's going to wrap it up for another video. Thanks for checking it out. Make sure you subscribe and go find the podcast. The podcast is on all your podcast apps. We're also online, growingpunkpod.com, and follow us on our social medias at growingpunkpod. That will do it though. So goodbye.